Thank you all for coming today to this talk by Helge Jordheim. I'm Stefano Girolanos, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the director of the Remark Institute, and I am absolutely delighted to be able to say that, and I assume I can speak for many others, that these weeks and the end of February just begin to get harder and harder. And so it's like a real pleasure to actually end a week like that with like the actual joy of listening to Helge. Helge is a professor of cultural history at the University of Oslo, and he has published extensively on 18th century intellectual culture in Europe, as well as on conceptual history and philology. To explain how extensively he has published on Europe, I will simply say that he breaks WorldCat. That is to say, if you go to WorldCat, you won't be able to tell what are articles and what are books. There's just there are too many of them, and there are a series of wonderful collaborations. You appear to be the sort of the perfect collaborator in this, so that you actually find it very difficult to let WorldCat do its usual like root-like thing. Instead, it's like it presents everything, which I think is also quite appropriate given the way that his work blends philology, 18th century culture, and conceptual history and theory of time. Helge is a major theorist of the pluralities of time, and I would say also the key figure in the beginning of the turn toward rethinking time and temporality, as well as the, let's say, second generation of the import of Reinhard Koselleck into the English-speaking world. I think he began this practically, also the turn to time, with his essay against periodization in history and theory. And again, on more recent occasions, recently with the essay titled Natural Histories for the Anthropocene. His first book was Der Staatsroman in Werk Wielands und Jan Pauls, which was published in 2007. And rather than compete with WorldCat into how we can collapse, I will simply say that he is currently working on a book concerning Berlin, and also on a book on representations of time in the early modern period, roughly between the decline of Christian time and the rise of modern time. So in the intermediary period, he's also been the principal investigator of several projects, including the NRC-funded project Lifetimes, A Natural History of the Present, which has been running since 2018. And he's also the co-editor, most recently, of Conceptualizing the World and Exploration Across Disciplines, which concerns the understandings of the world and representations, practices, and human experiences. This was published in 2018. A co-editor of Universal History and the Making of the Global, on the history of universal history from the Middle Ages until the end of the 18th century. And then with Margit Pernau, a co-editor of Civilizing Emotions on the Global History of the Concepts of Civility and Civilization from 2015. His awards are no less numerous. He received His Majesty the King's Gold Medal for the best dissertation in the humanities at the University of Oslo for the dissertation. And last week, he won the Housing Prize from the Royal Swedish Academy, and I wonder if we're even the first to celebrate on
more or less
in a room like this.
Thank you.
So with all this and no further ado, welcome, Helge.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. For that wonderful introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. For those on Zoom as well, I guess. And yeah, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to discussing these ideas, these materials with you. This is a work in progress, something I try to figure out. So I'm really interested in all your questions and comments. It will be about the 45-minute talk, I hope, and then I will have a discussion after that. So I'll just kick it off. Time, in a way I want to discuss with you here, is not an abstraction, nor is the form of intuition, as Kant would have it, nor a dimension of the universe, Pace Newton. Time for me in this context is a way we humans organize ourselves and our surroundings. Time is a way of living together. as such, it's fundamentally social and political. In other words, the following presentation is very much in line with the work Stefan, his co-editors, Natasha Wheatley and Dan Edelstein, have done in their brilliant collected volume, Time and Power, which came out a few years ago. Terrorist attacks and the way societies respond to them are fundamentally about time, would be my claim. My aim in this talk is to explore how terror shapes and are shaped by social time. And my case study, as you understand, will be the July 22nd, 2011 terror attacks in Norway, taking place in Oslo and at Utøya. So this discussion about how terror impacts time or how societies respond shall focus on two forms of representation, two genres, as it were. Both perform what I like to call time work. That is, they shape and reshape social time for political purposes. That is, for purposes of power and control. In other words, they're involved in a kind of activity we might call chronopolitics. By shaping time, they also shape events and actions. The genre I will be engaging with are the Manifesto and the timeline. There are a few reasons why I focus on these in particular. Most importantly, there are two of the genres that regularly form part of the kind of event that we become used to calling an act of terrorism, both in the preparations before the attack, in the attack itself, and in the aftermath, both on the side of the perpetrators and on the side of the victims, as well as state authorities. Among the things these genres do, the work they perform is the shaping of the temporal fabric of societies in a specific way. Furthermore, the Manifesto and the timeline differ from each other in a way that I consider to be non-trivial. One is a text, obviously, the other is a diagram. You're going to see many of those as we move on. One aims to bring about and give shape to a moment, an event, a rupture. The other aims to manage, measure, and represent continuity, the flow or passing of time, kairos or chronos, if you want to use the Greek terms. One primarily addresses qualitative experience, historical time. The other deals with a kind of time that is quantitative, homogeneous, universal, even mathematical, independent of anything external, as Newton would have it. So I could go on, but I think you get what I'm going to do here. I think that these differences are non-trivial. I think they're meaningful, even important, but they're also simplifications. So one of the aims in this talk is to question these presumptions about the Manifesto and the timeline. Most importantly, however, what I will present to you is an attempt to gain new knowledge, understand more, as it were, from the most violent event in Norwegian post-war history. After July 22nd, 2011, Norway was a different country. As Norwegians, we live forever in the aftermath of that date. Let's see. In other words, what I'd like to do is to find ways of thinking about terror and time that move beyond the language of shock and trauma, although I also address that. That tries to be more specific about how social time as a shared social construct, something we make use of to come together in society, is impacted by the force and violence of terrorist attacks and how we struggle to come to terms with it. So the talk will be in three parts. In the first, I'll discuss the idea of terrorist attacks as what I call time-shattering events that shatter the fabric of social time, as it were. Then in the second part, I'll analyze how the genre of the Manifesto performs such an act of time-shattering, bringing about a moment when word and action come to absolute convergence. Finally, in the third part, I'll explore the role of timelines in dealing with the trauma of terror as a work of mending time, a time-mending practice, if you like, which, however, also risks pulling apart the fabric of social time even more. Okay, so first, well, terror is a time-shattering event. So the question is, can time be shattered? Can events shatter time? Does it make sense to think about time in this way as something, some assemblage of things, a kind of fabric made up of experiences, practices, and objects that can be destroyed, pulled apart by the sheer force of a single event? And if time can be shattered, can it then be mended? Can the assemblage that is time be put back together again, realigned with itself, reassembled, resynchronized? In that case, what do time-shattering events and time-mending practices respectively look like? So, as you realize, my occasion for asking these questions is an event that took place in Norway a little more than 10 years ago. On July 22nd, 2011, Anders Behring Breivik, a 32-year-old white supremacist, carried out an attack on the Norwegian Social Democratic Party, Arbeiderpartiet. The first part of the attack took place in the center of Oslo, where he blew up the most prominent high-rise of the government quarter, housing several government ministries, killing 8 people and wounding many, many more. That's the building you see in the back. After planting the bomb, he drove out to the summer camp of the Social Democratic Youth Organization, AUF, at the island Utøya, the island you see, in the Lake Tyrifjorden, and began a killing spree that did not stop until it killed 69 people, mostly children and young people, when he was finally apprehended by Norwegian police. So by brutally ending 77 human lives, most of them still in their beginnings, Breivik changed Norwegian history forever. So one way of describing the impact of the July 22nd attacks is that they shattered the temporal fabric of Norwegian society by effectively breaking up the social and historical web that connects past, present, and future. In the book from 2012, the literary scholar Anne Fuchs points out how what she calls impact events might shatter the material and symbolic worlds that we inhabit. At least since the works of Benedict Anderson, Rainer Koselleck, Norbert Elias, Eviata Zerubbabel, and others, we know that societies rest on a shared set of temporal experiences, memories, and expectations organized according to certain structures or rhythms that regulate how members think about their own lives and the life of their communities. When something unexpected, in this case, something extremely brutal happens, that it disrupts the connection between experience and expectation, both diachronically and synchronically, we can, I argue, talk about the time-shattering event. So just offer a couple of illustrations that might just help think about that idea about time-shattering events. So the most striking representation of how the events of July 22nd shattered time is undoubtedly the broken clock face at Møllergata 19, now found in the information center in the government quarter. So when the bomb went off at 15:25, the clock face was shattered and a piece fell out, forever marking the exact time when 8 people working in the government ministries were brutally murdered. In the aftermath of the events, the broken clock face has become a diagram of crisis, effectively representing both the homogeneity and continuity of universal time and how it was suddenly interrupted and disrupted by a time-shattering event. However, not only quantitative universal time, clock time for short, was shattered. The same happened to hundreds, thousands of individual lives, lifetimes, individual biographies all over Norway. 77 people were killed, but many, many more were wounded, and thousands of others lost someone they loved or cared about. In all these cases, people felt how their temporal continuities of their lives were disrupted, how their lifetimes were shattered. An example can be found in one of the first autobiographical accounts published from survivors from Utøya, then 18 years old Emma Martinovic. In her book Lever, Alive, published in 2011, she writes, "I am thinking so much. My thoughts and feelings change all the time. My future is shattered. A little part of me always wanted to be a policewoman. That dream is so far away now." After she was shot and wounded at Utøya and had escaped by swimming toward the mainland until she was picked up by one of the neighbors in their boats, Emma lost her sense of time. In her current state, the present is a stream of ever-shifting thoughts and feelings, and the past, her dreams of becoming a police officer, has become disconnected, disjointed from the future, in which any such plan seems absolutely impossible. Time is out of joint, has lost its order, the past, present, future structure is no longer intact. So in a recent paper, the psychologist Gilead Hirschberger defines collective trauma as, I quote, "a cataclysmic event that shatters the basic fabric of society." And he adds, "Aside from the horrific loss of life, collective trauma is also a crisis of meaning." In the discussions of trauma as a cultural phenomenon, scholars like Shoshana Fellman, Dori Laub, Miki Ball, Jeffrey Alexanders, and others point to how traumatic events and memories cannot be reintegrated into narratives. They enter into endless cycles of repetitions and hauntings. Linearity and regularity is lost. The same goes for the continuity between past experiences, future expectations. Well, clock time and calendar time, usually the most solid defenses against temporal confusion, are equally affected. So I could give more examples of how time is shattered also on a collective level, how societies, both small communities across Norway who lost someone to the terror attacks, and the Norwegian state as such is unable to continue along the same trajectory, temporal trajectory as before the event. But at this point, I'll turn to the event itself to offer some more detail about how this shattering of time took place, not just by means of bullets and a 950-kilo bomb made of artificial fertilizer, but also by means of the document that came to be called Breivik's Manifesto. So on July 22nd, 2011, a little after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Anders Behring Breivik left his modest flat at Skøyen outside Oslo and drove into the center of the city, where he parked the car containing the bomb at the foot of the government building. Now, before he had left home, he had uploaded a document to the internet, to the platform Stormfront, used by right-wing extremists, and sent it as an email attachment to 2003 people, good patriots, as he would later call them. He also made a 12-minute long video in which he summed up the contents of the document and uploaded it to YouTube. The day after, even before the full extent of the attack was known to most people, journalists became aware that Breivik had published a document in which he discussed and explained his actions. Initially, there were certain doubts in the press whether it was ethically justifiable to write about the document before the police had made a public statement about it, especially since they couldn't be 100% sure that it wasn't a fake. Some journalists also expressed discomfort that by writing about it, they were acting out the terrorist playbook even after he had been apprehended. Give him exactly the kind of attention he was looking for. What they were not in doubt about was what kind of text they were dealing with, what kind of genre it could be attributed to. From the moment it was discovered, the document was referred to as Breivik's Manifesto, according to historical conventions about what kind of texts are associated with terrorist attacks. Examples abound, from the numerous addresses by the German Rote Armee-Fraktion to the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski, who famously made the New York Times publish his manifesto against civilization and technology, so he would end this campaign of letter bombs. At a closer look, however, the genre label Manifesto that offered the best fit with the rhetorical situation, to use Lloyd Bitzer and Carolyn Miller's term, did not fit as well with the document itself. The text that Breivik uploaded comprises 1,516 pages, organized in 3 parts with sections and subsections. It is written in English and carries the title 2083, a European Declaration of Independence. Already, numerous genre markers are in play. So you can see the numerical system ordering the sections, which is a staple in academic dissertations. The first part of the title reminding of a utopian novel, the second part alluding to the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. Other important paratexts are the name of the author, Andrew Berwick, an anglicized version of the birth name of the terrorist, and the place of publication, London. Then there's a subtitle in Latin, which is at the same time a dedication. De laude nove militiae pauperes commilitiones Christi templici Solomonici, in praise of the new poor knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, which is in part quotes another text, Liber ad milites templi de laude nove militiae, by Bernd of Clairvaux, a sermon or treatise written sometime between 1120 and 1136 in order to boost the morale of the newly founded order of the Knights Templar in preparation for the Second Crusade to the Holy Land. The list of generic markers continues. Something Breivik never calls his document, however, is manifesto. Since in his writing, this term is reserved for another publication, namely the Communist Manifesto, which is to blame for much of the cultural Marxism about to destroy Western civilization, according to Breivik. Furthermore, at the beginning of the document, Breivik explicitly labels the text a compendium, which comes from Latin and means handbook or textbook, but is mostly used to describe an assemblage of texts or excerpts from texts. And this is exactly what the declaration is. Most of the text, probably as much as 2/3, was not written by him, but cut and pasted from different sources on the internet, among them 350 pages written by the blogger Fjordman and published on the website Gates of Vienna. Nevertheless, the text was labeled Breivik's Manifesto by the Norwegian and international press, and is still being referred to by that term, not least by his admirers in the extreme right-wing blog sphere. Both David Sonoboli, who killed 9 and wounded 36 people in the Munich mall on the 5th anniversary of the Breivik attack, and Dylan Roof, who gunned down 9 African Americans in a church in Charleston in 2015, had written manifestos with reference to Breivik to explain and defend their actions. Several times during the trial, Breivik stated that his most important contribution to the liberation of Western civilization from socialism, multiculturalism, and most importantly, Islam, was the compendium, whereas the attack was only a way of drawing attention to it. So apart from stressing that the genre label Manifesto never came from Breivik himself, but rather from the Norwegian press, I'm not going to discuss the compendium in its entirety here. Rather, I'll try to understand how it deals with time, more precisely how it works to bring about the complete convergence of word and action in form of an impact event, as Anna Fuchs calls it, by narrative and chronological means. So Breivik's compendium has 3 parts, which operate in 3 different timescales. The first tells the long-term history of Islamic or Muslim imperialism from Muhammad's march on Mecca in 1626 to the Ottoman Empire to modern jihadism. The second part focuses on the present, the current political situation in Europe, whereas the third looks to the future in terms of plan, risk assessment, alliances, enemies, etc. The problem with this past, present, future structure, however, is that it constructs a narrative and a temporal continuity, a universal world historical drama based on the myth of a clash of civilizations, and not least the clash of religions, which doesn't really afford much agency to a young man, albeit a reborn Templar knight from Norway. Just for the last 20 pages of the compendium, he changes genre again in order to make space, or at least time, for his own life, his own thoughts and actions, his own day-to-day activities, the everyday of a terrorist, as it were. The genre that offers itself best to this change of temporal scale and rhythm is, unsurprisingly, the diary. So the final part of the compendium is organized by date, from May 2nd to July 22nd, 2011, as well as by numbering the 82 days Breivik spent making the final preparations for his mass killings. Most of the activities described are practical, even technical, like the way things you see here discusses how he cleaned this gas mask and how he mixes diesel and artificial fertilizer. The years and the centuries of Muslim imperialism is replaced by the months, weeks, and days in the life of a young Norwegian man in the process of becoming a terrorist, planning and preparing his actions. In the final entry in the diary, which is also the final entry in the compendium as a whole, yet another time scale, another temporal interval or rhythm is added, according to which the attack itself will unfold. Time is accelerating. We're now down to minutes. I believe this will be my last entry. It's now Friday, July 22nd, 12:51. Less than 2 hours later, the bomb in the government quarter exploded. Underneath, as a signature, he had his anglicized name as well as the title he had given himself as founding member of the Order of the Knights Templar. This, you see here, is also the sentence that tries to turn the compendium into a manifesto, when there's no longer any gap between words and actions, or rather that's the effect that Breivik himself wants to achieve. The last sentence of the compendium, which has been working on for months and years, the compendium that is, shall serve as the pivot, so to speak, when the words are no longer just words, but actions. This sentence is also a joint between multiple timescales. It gives the exact time down to the minute and thus introduces a timescale of the attack itself, but at the same time it activates other time layers, the longue durée of Muslim imperialism and the Knights Templar, the contemporary history of immigration and multiculturalism, and the impact event itself. In this way, he creates his own Kairos moment when he can seize the opportunity and act. Efforts to create moments like this we recognize from other fascist movements, not least from Hitler's own speeches, which were also staged as moments of absolute presence, the coming together of long-term world history, effective immediacy, glorious futures, rhetorics, all present in the same moment. So a crucial part of the time work of terrorism involves creating a destructive, violent now, brought about by means of guns and bombs, but also by means of words and texts. As scholars in the humanities and social sciences, as journalists and writers, we have little to offer in defense against physical violence, but it's all the more important that we're able to deconstruct the textual kairos to which the terrorist believes himself to be responding. To pull apart the different timescales that he strives to bring to convergence in writing. None of the other times evoked in his compendium are really present in this moment, except psychologically in Breivik's own head. He's not part of a long tradition of brave soldiers taking up arms against Islam, neither is he defending Norwegian cultural identity. And most importantly, his words and actions have nothing to do with each other, politically or historically speaking. When he walks out the door of his mother's apartment, he's a confused and radicalized young man about to commit a heinous crime, not a Knight Templar or defender of the Christian faith. The document he uploaded to the internet can do nothing to change that. As we know from Jacques Derrida and others, texts are places of absence, not presence. His words cannot contain his actions, they cannot even explain them. They must be judged on their own brutal, senseless merit. So to sum up so far, as part of the 22nd July attacks, the manifesto, or rather the compendium turned into a manifesto by the press post festum, represents one way of giving shape to time by collapsing multiple timescales and multiple temporal dimensions into one single kairotic moment in which only one person has agency. That is the perpetrator, the terrorist himself, and which is no longer possible to separate the past from the present or the future. Just that it's impossible to separate words from actions. Everything gets sucked into the black hole or the maelstrom of the event itself. Historically, this is one of the prototypical fascist temporalities inhabited both by Hitler and his followers, and more recently by the January 6th conspirators. This leaves us as humanities scholars and writers with the important critical task of deconstructing this moment, of pulling the different times, intentions, plans, actions, and words apart and point at the gaps and absences. Absences of meaning, of historicity, of empathy, of humanity. In order to perform this critical task, however, we need to understand more about the times of terror, I would claim. And this is where the timelines come in, the other genre that I'll engage with. In many ways, it serves as a counterpoint to the manifesto, in which all of time is reduced to a single point. The window through which the perpetrator steps into history is a moment of opportunity, as it were. The time of the timeline, as we shall see, do not in itself represent any kind of meaning or presence. Rather, most of the timelines are absences into which singular moments are placed and distributed. The time of the timeline is quantitative, durational, and diachronic. It's chronos time compared to the kairos of the manifesto. However, what if there's not one timeline, but many, all representing the same set of events, historically speaking, but with different actors, different material circumstances, different experiences and technologies? What if timelines represent not the unity, but the multiplicity of time? So this is what I'm going to try to discuss in the last part of the talk. So as I showed you before, Breivik's manifesto also contained a timeline or a diary in the form of a diary of the 82 days from his preparation started until he uploaded the document and left his mother's flat to put his deadly plan into action. All the other timelines I'll deal with here were produced in the aftermath. Looking through the innumerable, and this is where sort of this project started in a way for me, looking through the innumerable reports and evaluations that in various ways attempt to make sense of the events of July 22nd, there's no way to ignore the omnipresence of timelines. Press coverage, governmental evaluations, and scientific analysis alike feature visualizations of the events as points on a line or several lines in terms of discrete successive moments. So I'm just going to show you a few of these examples. And there are so many more of these. So in the upper left corner is a timeline of police. I'm not going to interpret them completely for you, but I'm going to just give you a hunch of what they are, but I think that can be useful. So in the upper left corner is a timeline of police response times found in the report from the so-called July 22nd Commission, appointed by the Norwegian government to evaluate how police and health authorities responded to the attacks. The report was published as an official government white paper in August 2012 and directed devastating criticism at faulty police emergency response and communication procedures. So at the top of this top left set of timelines, you see the general timeline from 1730, when the first police vehicle left for Utøya, until 1904, when all vehicles had arrived. The terrorist was apprehended at Utøya at 1834. I'm giving you now European times because that's the only thing I can do. I can't do AM and PM, I'm sorry, in this context at least. The parallel lines represent different police units. The squares are their arrivals at different stops on their way to the rallying point. Among the most striking and indeed devastating insights is the realization that the first police vehicle arrived at Utøya already before 1800, but waited for half an hour before going across to the island. So beside it, you see the timeline from another official report, which contains a self-evaluation of Norwegian police. This timeline is used to document why the police couldn't have arrived earlier. With a quote from the report itself, this timeline shows some of the mission that stole, this is the word used, resources from the police efforts, and at the same time contributed to creating a complex overall picture of the situation. This is a different kind of timeline, visually speaking, in which every time on the minute scale is correlated with specific events. So between 1525 and 1529, that's sort of the part you see here, there were no less than 7 reports about explosion, bombs, and wounded at different places in the center of Oslo. So then moving to the bottom left, this is the timeline mounted on the wall of the July 26th Information Center, located at the site where the first attacks took place. The timeline begins when the terrorist leaves his car at the government quarter filled with explosives and ends with a picture taken of the island Utøya from the mainland at 22:23 the same evening. Thus, it represents the terrorist attack from the perspective of the victims, which for most of the day corresponds in a rather cruel and terrifying way to the perspective of the time perspective of the perpetrator. No attempts are made at explaining the attack by showing the events that led up to it, or the lack of security both at the government quarter and at Utøya. So this is a timeline of memory more than a timeline of reconstruction and explanation. Then do 2 more quite quickly. The most comprehensive and technologically advanced timeline, that's the one you see with the red square, a rectangle at the top, was published by the Norwegian Public Broadcasting Company, NRK. So by clicking on one of the 3 headings at the top, one can choose between 3 different timelines labeled Anders Behring Breivik, 24 Hours of Terror, and The Aftermath. For the 2 last one has the possibility of choosing between 3 filters, highlighting events connected to the perpetrator, to the police efforts, and as well as other events. In the default mode, all kinds of events are woven together with the effect that different kinds of simultaneities come into view. While the former Prime Minister of Norway, and this is what you see in the pictures, while the former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Harlem Brundtland, is speaking to the young people at Utøya, Breivik parks his escape car in a parking lot close to the government quarter. Finally, on the far right, the tabloid newspaper Verdens Gang is a timeline of the life of the mass murderer, Anders Behring Breivik, from his birth to the moment the bomb went off, illustrated with private pictures. So I could go on. There's so many more. I mean, we could go to hospital timelines, to rescue timelines. There's to sort of more psychiatric timelines reconstructed to help people remember or think about what they've experienced. But I think you've seen enough to sort of follow the argument I'm going to try to make. So that these lines give shape to time needs no further discussion. And in lives like these have been dominated Western perception and management of time since antiquity, if we are to believe Anthony Grafton and Dan Rosenberg in their book about the history of timelines. As you can see, and as Grafton and Rosenberg shows, line can take different shapes. Paradoxically, maybe. Some look more like tables, others like trees. All of them, however, represent beginnings, endings, and intervals, plotted onto a linear diagram that represent the flow of time itself. So in the final part of the talk, I'll discuss a bit what these timelines do, what I think they do, what kind of time work they perform, and what they can tell us about the relationship between terror and time. And I think there are two different answers to this question. So I've written up some of this before and given one of the answers, but I think more and more, I think it's the wrong one, or at least it's not sufficient to understand what's going on. So if the impact of the manifesto and the following attacks was to shatter time, make it incomprehensible, unwieldy, whether it's the lifetimes of individual people as Emma Martinovic or the times of Norwegian history, one way to understand the timelines is as a work to mend and reassemble the shattered fabric of time, weaving it together again, so to speak, both vertically and horizontally, both diachronically and synchronically, both along the timeline and across it. Events including the cold-blooded murders of 77 people are reintegrated into diachronic durational temporal series, which re-establish temporal continuity in accordance with principles of succession and causation. These timelines are designed to answer mainly two questions that were on the lips of every Norwegian and certainly many others in the day after the attacks. What really happened and how could it have been avoided, stopped. In other words, these timelines were produced for the specific purpose to document why it took the police emergency unit so long to get to the island and stop the terrorists. Timelines plotting the mobilization of helicopters and boats, first sightings of the perpetrator, as well as first reports of shooting at Utøya are designed to account for the amount of time that passed, what caused the delay, what faulty procedure or human error was responsible. But in addition to diachronic succession and causal relations, timelines also map synchronic simultaneities, as we really just heard. Several of the July 22nd timelines document what happened elsewhere while the Utøya killings took place. At the Communication Central for Emergency Medicine, the IMK, at different police headquarters, at Rygge Airfield, even at the dock of the mainland while the police was trying to get officers across to the island. Furthermore, timelines both in the information center and at Utøya contains text messages in which teenagers try to get in touch with their parents to warn them about what's going on. In this way, the chronological simultaneity visualized by the timelines is expanded to include even more people and places lined up in parallel at any chronologically defined moment. Now, so in principle, because of the quality of universal time, in a sense, there's really no limit to what and who can be included in the timeline. The universality of timelines prompts anyone who has an emotional or a practical relationship to the terrorist attack to think about where they were, what they were doing during those desperate 85 minutes between 1708 and 1833, when 69 young boys and girls were shot to death. In his 1983 book on imaginary communities, Benedict Anderson discusses how the date on the front page of the newspaper creates a feeling of community between readers, even though they've never seen or met each other. This synchronizing effect is even more pronounced when the media in question are not just physically distributed newspapers, but phone calls, text messages, public warnings, and after a while, live news coverage on television and radio. Across the world, people can tell exactly what they were doing when they first heard about the planes crashing into World Trade Center. Across Norway, people can offer similar information about their whereabouts and what they were engaged in when the news about the terror attacks reached them. For most Norwegians, synchronizing with the events at Utøya happened post-festum. By aligning their own individual or our own individual timelines with the timelines produced by newspapers and television channels, people can make the terrorist attacks part of their own life. In other words, they use their own lives as a temporal form into which the time-shattering events of July 22nd can be placed, reintegrated. In this way, extreme events, which seem to take place in a different time altogether, are reintegrated with the social time of people's lives alongside trivial events like working, shopping, cooking, and spending time with friends. We accept them as part of our own reality, at least in a temporal sense, as part of our own lifetimes. In other words, timelines should not be understood only as diachronic series of successive homogeneous events, but also as possible cross-sections into the flow of time, which cut through and thus align multiple and often very different trajectories and narratives. Any moment of any of the July 22nd timelines contain endless lives and lifetimes, endless diachronic trajectories from the past through the present into the future, aligned by the reference to universal chronological time. Not all of these lifetimes are embodied primarily by humans. Some are assemblages of human and non-human actors, such as helicopters, boats, and cars, as well as emergency warning procedures, like the national alarm. In these temporal assemblages, human intentions are often thwarted by material and administrative shortcomings. So that brings us to the other kind of time and memory work that I think is performed by these timelines, which instead of weaving times together seems to be pulling them apart. Faced with all these timelines, one is struck by the multiplicity of times that are accounted for in the different reports and white papers. There's a time of the police, there's time of victims, there's time of the perpetrator, the times of helicopters and inflatable boats, of national warning procedures and response times. And the report from the Søfteland Committee, who tried to acquit the Norwegian police of any blame whatsoever, the process to get the military helicopters from the 720 Squadron at Rugge airfield in the air gets its own timeline. In the work to come to terms with the event, different durations inherent to processes and materials are disengaged from each other. They contradict and come in conflict with each other, offer different versions of reality, even different ontologies. In response to the time-shattering event of the terrorist attack, our shared temporal frameworks, the times we live by and co-produce, split up into divergent timelines, documenting different causalities and producing conflicting narratives. So ever since timelines became much-loved tools of European historical imagination in the 17th and 18th century, here at Joseph Priestley's famous chart, they've had a double function. And you can see it very clearly here. On the one hand, aligning events, lives, and chronologies to synchronized whole. On the other hand, exposing the multitudes of non-synchronous times inherent in different forms of life here in different nations at different scales and rhythms. So that also happens in the case of the terror attack. Thus, rather than mending the fabric of time, the timelines seem to unravel it even more. In the attempt to create one singular, credible, coherent, and true temporal ontology, an ontochronology, if you like, the timelines risk breaking up time into separate and incommensurable worlds, containing different people, things, technologies, and different forms of politics. Most of these differences can be summed up in three features of the timeline: when it begins, when it ends, and what are the intervals. I'm coming to the end. I didn't look at the time. How? I'm fine? Okay. I didn't look at the time. That feels an absurd thing to say right now. I didn't look at my own timeline. Okay, but then I can do a couple of examples. So, as already mentioned, the 17-meter-long timeline at the 22nd of July center begins with the explosion and ends with a picture taken at the island Utøya from the mainland at 22:23 in the evening. That's the picture says at the end there. According to the historian in charge of the exhibition, the intention, I quote, was to take people back to the moment when Norway was hit by terror. He does not comment on the specific use of a timeline to achieve this effect, but the choice of temporal intervals seems to fit precisely with his intentions. The moment Norway was hit by terror is defined and delimited. By contrast, both the Jørv Commission, the newspaper VG, and the National Broadcasting Company, NRK, made timelines documented periods that precede and succeed the event itself, documenting prehistory and aftermath, causes and effects. For example, the newspaper timeline recounts the life of the terrorist Anders Behring Breivik from his birth on January 13, 1979, until he commits these extremely brutal and ruthless acts of terrorism on July 22, 2011, at the age of 32, in large detail with a number of private photographs. A similar life story is mapped out by the other timeline you see on your right, produced by the Norwegian Public Broadcasting. However, the two timelines differ in what they include in Breivik's biography. The newspaper timeline is clearly more private and personal, especially in the use of photos, whereas the NRK timeline documents systematically the material surroundings of Breivik's life, the houses he lived in, the public institutions he visited, as well as the receipts for ammunition, fertilizers, and other things he needed to carry out the attack. Both timelines document the parents' divorce, the encounter with child welfare services, the lack of contact with his father, etc. In this sense, both timelines seems to argue that the causes for the attack can be found in the childhood and adolescence of the perpetrator, and thus opt for a psychological or psychiatric rather than a political explanation of the crime. As such, they seem to support the first of the two psychiatric evaluations presented at the trial, declaring him of unsound mind and thus not responsible for his actions. This was later set aside by the second evaluation, which was made the basis for the conviction. This is one of the huge discussions in the aftermath of how do we relate to sort of a report that declared him unfit to go to prison, of unsound mind, and in relation to sort of what was by many considered as a political act, and what would those two reports mean. Another important difference between timelines is the choice of temporal intervals: years, dates, hours, or seconds. While the timelines of the terrorist biography extend over years, even decades, the timelines of the attack span only a few hours. Time seems to be accelerating more and more fateful events stack up. Every minute becomes significant, measured against the loss of life at Utøya. On several occasions, the minute rhythm of police timelines is still not fine-grained enough to separate the different incidents and organize them in relation to each other in terms of before and after. Instead, we're confronted with simultaneities. As you can see here, at 1729, the head of operations at Northern Buskerud Police District received orders to distribute weapons to his officers. But at the same time, the emergency center received yet another report from a civilian about shots fired at Utøya. In this way, the timelines illustrate how there are moments when events stack up and time accelerates in a way that complicates decision-making. A crisis is a moment in history when time accelerates, things happen at the same time rather than in succession, and normal procedures for planning and deciding are suspended. So now I'm coming to the end. So, based on these findings, we can safely say that timelines have various functions, which in part contradict each other. On the one hand, they reconstruct logically the succession of events, highlighting relations of cause and effect, planning and implementation, attempt and failure. On the other hand, they returns us to the opacity, ambiguity, and confusion of certain specific moments when the future represented by the timeline still had not emerged on the horizon of the historical actors. These functions warrant very different forms of chronopolitics. Whereas the first kind distributes blame, identifies intentions and reasons, attribute cause to effects, and thus hold people in leading positions in Norwegian society accountable. The second adopts less of a post festum, more of an in medias res perspective, according to which futures are opaque, decisions are all split second, and contingencies disrupt the link between cause and effect. Another analytical perspective concerns the multitude of times emerging from this multitude of timelines, operating on different scales and with their own intervals and rhythms, and featuring a wide range of actors, procedures, processes, technologies, and even life forms. From police officers and their weapons, doctors and their surgical instruments, to family relations, friendships expressed in text and Twitter messages. These multiple times become entangled through dialectics of synchronization and desynchronization. On the one hand, they're brought in sync by the actions of the terrorists, forming a timeline of destruction and death. On the other hand, they deviate from each other due to procedures and actions that resist synchronization, cause time lags, followed by sudden bursts of acceleration, moments of too early and too late, etc. So where does all of this leave the politics of time? Most striking, perhaps, is the absence of a super synchronizer, to use a term from Niklas Luhmann, that could have aligned all these possible temporalities mapped onto different timelines. Possible narratives that could have filled this function for Luhmann, it's fate, but or destiny, but they could have filled this function in this context include the history of Norway, the history of social democracy, more specifically the history of the Norwegian Social Democratic Party, and even more the youth branch that suffered the brunt of the attack. But also the history of Islamophobia and right-wing extremism in Europe and the Western world generally. So far, this desperately needed integration of the 22nd July events into the grand narratives of this particular moment has failed, at least on a national level. leaving the work to create the permanent national memorial for the victims, as well as other parts of the memory work, in limbo for several years. Thus, it can only count as an instance of irony, I think, that the recently inaugurated second or third attempt national memorial at Utøya, that is not on the island but at the harbor on the mainland, takes the shape of a timeline. A row of columns symbolizing each of the 77 victims, on which the sun will mark the passing of time, or in the words of the project director, I quote, "The timeline is very central to the events during the two attacks at government quarter at Utøya. For this reason, the architects have chosen to make use of the sun as a time indicator and connect it with what happened." To what extent this timeline succeeds to become the super synchronizer, in Luhmann's terms, that is finally able to integrate the events of July 22nd into Norwegian history and other history is an open question. But for now, and like Luhmann, I remain very doubtful. Thank you for your attention.